Hello, dear. I'm Grandma Ruth, and I've been cooking in one kitchen or another for well over 60 years now. Ever since I was a girl, standing on a wooden stool at my own mother's elbow, barely tall enough to see over the counter, watching her hands move through a recipe she never once needed to write down. In all that time, I've learned an awful lot the hard way: burned suppers, tough meat, cracked pastry, wasted food. I'm not proud to admit I threw straight in the trash because I simply didn't know any better at the time, and more than a few evenings spent apologizing to my husband over a meal that hadn't turned out quite the way I'd hoped. Nobody handed me a little book of kitchen wisdom when I got married and started cooking for a family of my own. There was no video to watch back then, no neighbor down the street with a channel of her own sharing what she'd learned. Just a young bride standing at a stove, guessing her way through supper most nights and hoping for the best. I picked most of it up slowly, one mistake at a time, over decades of standing at this very stove, and a good many of those lessons cost me a ruined dinner or a wasted afternoon before they ever sank in properly. So today I want to hand you the 10 things I wish somebody had sat me down and told me plainly all those years ago, back when I was young and certain I already knew everything there was to know about a kitchen. If even one of these saves you the years of trial and error it took me to learn it myself, then this whole video was worth making, and I'll consider it a job well done. The first one goes back to nearly every roast I ruined in my first 10 years of marriage, and it still stings a little to think about how many good pieces of meat I sent to the table dry and disappointing before I finally understood what I was doing wrong. All that money spent on a good cut for nothing but a chewy, sorry supper. I used to pull a roast or a chicken straight out of the oven and start carving into it within a minute or two, eager to get supper on the table before it went cold, proud of myself for timing everything so well right up until the first slice fell apart under the knife. What I didn't know was that meat needs to rest after it comes out of the heat, sitting there untouched under a loose tent of foil for at least 10 to 15 minutes before you ever put a knife to it. While that meat cooks, all its juices get pushed toward the center, away from the heat, and if you slice into it right away, every bit of that juice runs straight out onto the cutting board in a little pool, leaving you with meat that's dry and disappointing no matter how carefully you cooked it in the first place. Let it rest, and those juices settle back through the whole piece evenly so every slice comes out just as moist as the one before it, right down to the very last piece served at the table. I wasted more good roasts than I care to count before an older neighbor finally took pity on me one Sunday afternoon and explained why my meat kept coming out dry, no matter what I did differently in the oven, no matter how carefully I watched the clock or checked the temperature. A smaller cut like a chicken breast or a pork chop only needs about 5 minutes of rest, while a big holiday turkey or a whole roast deserves a good 20 to 30 minutes under that foil tent before you carve. So keep that in mind depending on what you've got cooking that particular evening. Second, and this one cost me more sauces than I'll ever admit to over the years, save a cup of that starchy water before you drain your pasta. A habit I never once thought to question until it was pointed out to me plain as day one evening at a friend's table. I used to pour the whole pot straight down the drain without a second thought, water and all, watching all that cloudy water swirl away without ever once wondering if it might be good for something, and then wonder why my sauce always looked thin and watery, sliding right off the noodles instead of clinging to them the way it does at a good restaurant or in my own mother's kitchen, come to think of it. Though I never once asked her why hers looked so different from mine. That starchy pasta water is exactly what a sauce needs to bind together properly, since all that starch released while the noodles cook is a natural thickener sitting right there in the pot, free for the taking, a splash stirred in at the end. Thickens the sauce just slightly and helps it cling to every strand instead of pooling at the bottom of the bowl in a thin, sorry puddle. Watery and pale looking, nothing at all like what you'd hope to set down on the table. I must have made 100 disappointing plates of spaghetti before somebody finally told me to keep a cupful back before I tip that pot down the drain, and I've kept a little mug sitting right by the sink for that exact purpose ever since. It works just as well thinning down a sauce that's gotten a bit too thick, sitting on the stove, as it does thickening one that's too thin. So don't be afraid to add it a splash at a time, tasting and adjusting as you go, whichever direction your sauce happens to need. Third, nobody told me for the longest time that butter and eggs need to come to room temperature before you start most any baking recipe. And I paid for that ignorance with cake after cake that never quite rose the way the picture in my recipe book promised it would, no matter how faithfully I followed every other instruction on the page. I used to pull them straight from the icebox and get right to work, cold as could be, wondering why my cakes came out dense and heavy in the middle and my cookies spread out flat and thin across the pan instead of holding their shape the way a proper cookie should. Cold butter simply won't cream properly with sugar. It stays stiff and lumpy instead of turning light and pale and fluffy. And that fluffiness is exactly what traps the little air pockets that make a cake rise soft and tender in the oven instead of sitting there dense as a brick. Cold eggs dropped into a bowl of creamed butter can cause the whole mixture to seize up and separate right before your eyes instead of blending in smooth, leaving you with a curdled, sorry-looking batter no amount of extra mixing will fix, no matter how long you stand there stirring and hoping it'll come together on its own. Set your butter and your eggs out on the counter a good hour before you start baking, and you'll notice the difference in your very first batch, I promise you that. If you're ever in a real hurry and forgot to plan ahead, a bowl of warm water can bring cold eggs up to temperature in just a few minutes, and slicing your butter into thin pieces will soften it a good deal faster than leaving the whole stick sitting there whole. Fourth, and this is one I learned the hard way, standing over a smoking skillet more times than I'd like to remember. With the window thrown wide open and the whole kitchen filled with steam instead of that good brown smell you want, don't crowd your pan when you're frying or searing anything, no matter how tempting it is to get the whole job done in one single batch. I used to pile the whole pound of meat or the entire bag of vegetables into one pan all at once, trying to save myself a second batch and a bit of time on a busy evening. What actually happens is all that food releases moisture as it heats, and crowded together in one pan with nowhere for that steam to escape, everything just steams in its own juices and comes out pale and soggy instead of getting that nice golden sear you're after. Give your food room to breathe in the pan, plenty of space between each piece. Cook it in batches if you need to, even if it takes a bit longer, and you'll get that proper golden crust every single time, instead of wondering why your chicken never browns up the way it does when somebody else cooks it for you at a restaurant. A pan that's properly hot before the food ever touches it matters just as much as the space you give it. So let your skillet warm up good and thoroughly before you add a single piece, rather than rushing the whole process along. Fifth, I went a good 20 years of my married life never once toasting a spice before I used it, simply shaking it straight from the jar into whatever I was cooking without a second thought, the way I'd watched my own mother do it 1,000 times before me, never once questioning whether there might be a better way sitting right there under my nose. A neighbor of mine, a woman who'd grown up cooking with far more spices than I ever had at my own mother's table, showed me one afternoon how a minute or two in a dry, hot pan, just until you can smell them properly rising up off the stove, wakes a spice cleanup, releasing oils that have been sitting dormant in that jar for who knows how long, sometimes years, tucked away in the back of a cabinet. Cumin, coriander, whole. Peppercorns, even a stick of cinnamon. All of them turn from flat and dusty tasting to rich and fragrant with nothing more than a minute or two of heat before they ever touch your food. And the difference in flavor is a good deal more noticeable than you'd ever guess from such a small and simple step. The kind of thing you almost feel foolish for not having tried decades sooner. I've never gone back to skipping that step since the day she showed me. Not once, not even when I'm in a hurry and tempted to shortcut my way through supper. It's strange to think about now how different a kitchen was 60 years ago compared to the one I'm standing in today. We didn't have half the conveniences you've got now. No little screen to look up a recipe the moment you got stuck. No video to pause and rewind if you missed a step the first time through. Not even a proper cookbook in a lot of houses. Just a recipe box full of handwritten cards passed down from one kitchen to the next. We learned from whoever happened to be standing nearby, a mother, an aunt, a neighbor leaning over the fence on a Tuesday afternoon with a bit of advice she'd picked up from her own mother years before. And if nobody happened to mention a particular trick, you simply went without it for years, the way I did with every single one of these. I think that's part of why I love making these videos so much, truth be told. Sitting here, talking to you the way I wish somebody had once sat and talked to me. Somewhere out there, some young bride just starting out is standing at her own stove tonight, wondering why her sauce won't thicken or her cake won't rise, feeling just as lost and unsure of herself as I once did. And if I can spare her even one of the years it took me to figure these things out on my own, well, that feels like time well spent to me. Sixth, for years I scraped every bit of browned bits stuck to the bottom of my pan, straight into the sink along with the dishwater, running hot water over the whole mess and scrubbing until my arm ached, thinking it was nothing but burnt mess to be scrubbed away and gotten rid of as quick as possible before it had the chance to dry on and make the job even harder. That browned bit stuck to the pan after you've cooked a piece of meat is called the fond, a fine French word for something I once thought of as nothing but a nuisance, and it's carrying more flavor than you'd ever guess just looking at it sitting there dark and crusty at the bottom of the pan. Pour a splash of wine, broth, or even plain water into that hot pan right after you've taken the meat out, and scrape at the bottom with a wooden spoon while it bubbles and hisses and lifts every bit of that flavor free from the metal underneath. What you're left with is the beginning of a proper gravy or pan sauce, deep and rich, made from nothing but what was already sitting right there in the pan the whole time, costing you nothing extra at all. And I threw that flavor down the drain for years before anybody ever told me what I was wasting every single time I cooked a piece of meat. A splash of cream or a small pat of cold butter whisked in at the very end will smooth that sauce out even further, turning what started as a bit of scraped up pan drippings into something you'd be proud to serve alongside your very best roast. And there's a real pleasure in knowing you made something that good from what most folks would have simply washed down the drain without a second thought. Seventh, I ruined more good knives than I like to admit by never learning to keep them properly sharp, letting them sit in a drawer year after year, getting duller and duller until chopping an onion felt like a wrestling match instead of a simple kitchen task, the blade sliding and skidding off the skin instead of biting cleanly into it the way it should. And I want to tell you plainly, a dull knife is a good deal more dangerous in your hand than a sharp one ever will be, no matter how backward that might sound to somebody who's never been taught otherwise. A sharp blade slices clean through with barely any pressure at all, while a dull one forces you to push and saw and wrestle with your food, bearing down harder than you should have to. And that's exactly when a knife is most likely to slip sideways off a stubborn piece of squash or a slick tomato and catch a finger instead of the vegetable you were aiming for, which is precisely how I ended up at the kitchen table more than once with a dish towel wrapped tight around my hand. A few strokes across a honing steel before you start cooking, just to true up the edge, and a proper sharpening every month or two on a whetstone keeps a blade doing its job the way it's meant to. And it makes every single task in the kitchen faster, easier, and a good deal safer besides. Wash your good knives by hand right after you use them too, rather than tossing them into a sink full of soapy water where they might be sitting blade up against another dish waiting to catch an unsuspecting hand reaching in to feel around for the drain plug without a second thought about what else might be hiding under the suds. Eighth, when it came to pastry and pie dough, I used to roll mine out the very minute I finished mixing it, impatient to get supper or dessert finished and onto the table before anybody's patience ran thin waiting around the kitchen, certain that a few extra minutes wouldn't make a lick of difference either way. What I didn't understand was that dough needs time to rest in the refrigerator, wrapped up snug in a bit of wax paper or plastic, for at least 30 minutes before you roll it, sometimes longer for a proper pie crust that needs to hold its shape well. That resting time lets the gluten in the flour relax after all that mixing and kneading, so your dough rolls out smooth and tender instead of springing back and shrinking the moment you try to fit it into the pan, pulling away from the edges no matter how carefully you'd pressed it in. I fought with more stubborn, shrinking pie crusts in my younger years than I care to remember, cursing under my breath at a crust that simply wouldn't behave, all because I couldn't wait that extra half hour before reaching for the rolling pin. If your kitchen runs warm, especially in the middle of summer with the oven already going for something else, that dough can soften up again quicker than you'd expect once it's out on the counter. So I like to pop it back in the refrigerator for another 10 minutes, part way through rolling if it starts sticking or getting difficult to work with. Ninth, and this one saved me a good deal of wasted food once I finally learned it, label and date everything that goes into your freezer every single time without exception, no matter how certain you feel in the moment that you'll surely remember what it is come next month, because I promise you, you won't, not after the third or fourth container's gone in on top of it. For years, I tucked things away thinking I'd surely remember what was in each container, and when I'd put it there, confident in my own memory in a way I had no real business being. And time and again, I'd pull out some mystery bundle wrapped in foil months later with absolutely no idea whether it was still good or how long it had been sitting in there, gathering frost. A bit of masking tape and a marker right on the lid or wrapped around the bag, with the contents and the date written plain as day for anybody in the house to read, has saved me from throwing out more good food than I can count, and it's saved me from eating something a good deal older than I'd have liked, too, which is its own kind of blessing in a home with young grandchildren coming and going through the kitchen. Most cooked leftovers hold up well in the freezer for about 3 months, while raw meat can often go a good bit longer. So knowing the date isn't just about avoiding a mystery, it's about knowing what to reach for first, working your way through the oldest containers before they slip past their best, and end up wasted after all that trouble of freezing them in the first place. And 10th, the very last one, and it might be the simplest of the whole bunch, though it took me the longest to actually believe it mattered enough to bother with, since it seemed like such a small and fussy extra step for such an ordinary vegetable. Salt your eggplant and your zucchini, sliced or cubed, and let them sit in a colander for a good 20 or 30 minutes before you ever cook them, right there over the sink where the moisture can drip away freely. I used to skip this step entirely, tossing them straight into the pan the moment I'd finished cutting them, and wondered every single time why my eggplant came out bitter enough to make a face over, and my zucchini turned watery and limp, no matter how hot I got the oil beforehand. That salt draws out the excess moisture sitting inside the vegetable, pulling it right out. Through the cut surfaces in little beads, you can watch forming if you're patient enough to wait, along with a good bit of the bitterness that comes along with it, in the case of eggplant especially. Once you rinse that salt away and pat the pieces dry with a clean towel, they cook up firm and flavorful instead of soggy and disappointing, browning properly in the pan instead of steaming in their own watery juices the way mine always used to. It's a small step, only 20 or 30 minutes, but it's the difference between an eggplant dish nobody wants seconds of and one that disappears clean off the platter before the rest of supper's even served. So there you have it, 10 things I wish somebody had sat me down and told me plainly 60 years ago, back when I was standing at this very stove, certain I already had it all figured out, young and stubborn and far too proud most days to ask for help even when I clearly needed it. It's a funny thing, looking back now, how much of what I know today came from nothing more than getting it wrong first, sometimes over and over, until I finally understood why, whether that meant a dry roast, a bitter eggplant, or a crust that shrank right up before my eyes, no matter how carefully I'd pressed it into the pan. I think that's simply how most of us learn to cook, truth be told. Not from a book sitting open on the counter, but from years of small failures nobody ever warns you about ahead of time, each one teaching you something the last one couldn't quite get through to you, no matter how many times you'd read the same recipe over and wondered where you'd gone wrong. I hope I've saved you at least a few of those wasted suppers and ruined pie crusts along the way, and spared you a bit of the frustration that came along with each one of mine. Tell me down in the comments which one of these you didn't know either. I'd genuinely love to hear it. Or, better yet, tell me the one thing you wish somebody had told you sooner in your own kitchen, since I do love hearing that I'm not the only one who learned these things the hard way, one burnt supper and one shrinking pie crust at a time. I'm Grandma Ruth. Thank you for listening to Grandma Knows Best.